people don't think Pratt might be anti-gay because he's a Christian. They think he might be anti-gay because his pastor once produced a film that called gay people sexually broken. It's really hard to argue that your friend supports gay people if he won't publicly say that he does, but it's easy to argue that your friend is nice to you. Hello there and welcome to my channel. My name is Kristen, and here I like to discuss social issues through the context of public figures and media. Today I'm going to be discussing the controversy that surrounded Chris Pratt a little bit over the summer in regards to his association with an evangelical church that some people say is homophobic. So let's just dive right into it, shall we? Screenwriter Amy Berg tweeted pictures of 4 Hollywood Chris's: Chris Pratt, Chris Pine, Chris Evans, and Chris Hemsworth, along with the line, "One has to go." This is a common Twitter meme in which people vote out their least favorite of 4 options. The internet mostly said that Chris Pratt was the worst Chris because of his attendance at a church that is very likely homophobic. Whether or not that church is homophobic is a topic for another day. And yeah, it was honestly not a big deal. They do these kinds of polls on Twitter pretty much all the time, and people on Twitter are always criticizing somebody. Additionally, public figures are subject to a certain amount of criticism, and rightly so, because who you endorse matters, and what rights you choose to speak up about matter. The accusations against his church are serious. That said, this whole thing would have blown over because it always does. Chris's career would have been fine. He's certainly not the first celebrity to be criticized for a group that he associates with, and he won't be the last. And all of those people have been mostly fine. But some people could not just let it be, and they had to speak up. You see, E! News also shared this question on their Instagram, and this caught the eyes of his wife, Catherine. She commented on the post about the poll, decrying it as bullying and saying there are worse things going on in the world right now and that we shouldn't be mean. Is this really what we need? There's so much going on in the world, and people are struggling in so many ways. Being mean is so yesterday. There's enough room to love all these guys. Love is what we need, not meanness and bullying. Let's try that. It was ridiculous. Interestingly, she did not feel the need to be specific about what other more important issues there are to talk about or how we can help the people struggling that she mentioned. She just seemed to want to use other people's struggles as a shield from criticism. Additionally, as previously stated, this meme format of choose your least favorite of 4 popular options is very common, and it's not out of the ordinary for famous people to be included in these memes, so this just wasn't bullying. Other Marvel stars and collaborators, including Mark Ruffalo, Robert Downey Jr., and director James Gunn, also voiced support for Chris Pratt. They all said something along the lines of, "Chris Pratt is a great guy. He always shows positivity. Don't assume his political beliefs because he's a Christian." You get it. I don't have a fundamental problem with wanting to speak up and say, hey, my friend is nice and I like him, when you hear people saying unkind things. However, every statement in defense of Chris declined to actually refute the claims made about him. Nobody said, Chris accepts gay people as they are and he affirms their rights. He does not think it's wrong to be gay. Chris himself has never said that either. Noah Bertlasky made a strong point in his piece for The Observer, where he basically said, someone can be positive and usually apolitical, but still think that LGBTQ people shouldn't be allowed to marry and that they're going to hell. You can have bigoted views and be nice to people. Noah also asked, why speak up at all if you're not going to address the criticism? Well, to try and understand their motivation, he cited philosopher Kate Mann, who argues that our culture has a strong impulse to empathize with and identify with powerful men, leading to a desire to defend them. Despite the fact that the majority of Pratt's critics are relatively random people on the internet with no real power to cancel him, his fellow powerful male friends perceive this criticism as a threat to him. This, of course, pales in comparison to the actual threat faced by Pratt's LGBTQ+ critics, which is systemic homophobia. Unfortunately, that's not something that Chris and his straight friends can really relate to, so it gets dismissed. They paint his critics as people who are calling him mean, when really they're calling out his association to homophobic institutions like Hillsong Church and giving him the opportunity to clear up any misunderstanding. He could denounce homophobia if he wanted to, but he hasn't. I think it's worth digging a little bit into the way their responses to his most recent criticism and the way Chris's response to criticism like this in the past functions on a rhetorical basis. Anyone who pays even a little attention should be able to see through their empty words and realize that they aren't actually addressing the criticism. But the responses serve to obfuscate what the actual problem is and assuage concern of any idle passerby that just wants to watch Chris Pratt movies without thinking too much. This can be seen plainly by how it was reported in popular media. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that later, but first let's look at their statements. Mark Ruffalo said, "You all, Chris Pratt is as solid man as there is. I know him personally, and instead of casting aspersions, look at how he lives his life. He is just not overtly political as a rule. This is a distraction. Let's keep our eyes on the prize. We are so close now." By opening his statement with a general claim that Chris is a solid man, someone unfamiliar with the situation might get the impression that people were saying Chris Pratt is not a solid person, which would be quite strange criticism, frankly. This serves to obfuscate the actual issue at hand and shift the goalposts. Now he's trying to make critics prove that Chris is an unequivocally bad person, instead of just a complicated person who has ties to anti-gay organizations and has not denounced homophobia. Then he establishes credibility by reminding readers that he knows Chris personally, and he asks us to look at how he lives his life. He doesn't bring up any examples of how Chris lives his life in any particular way, though, but rather he uses this vague statement to give the impression that Chris must live his life in a really awesome way. Otherwise, why would he say that? He chastises people for casting aspersions, implying that the criticism was overly harsh or untrue. Next, he states that Chris is not overtly political, the first indicator as to what this criticism was all about. He doesn't specify the political issue at hand, but given the context, it would seem that Mark Ruffalo is trying to paint LGBTQ+ equality as a political issue instead of a human rights issue. Either way, he's further trying to obfuscate the point of the original criticism with vagueness. He closes his statement out by saying that this is a distraction and we need to keep our eyes on the prize. He's likely referring to the 2020 presidential election because he was an open backer of Joe Biden's campaign. This sort of "we should focus on more important things" type of argument always rubs me the wrong way because it implies somebody can't care about more than one thing at a time, or that spending 2 minutes tweeting about something relatively trivial is some grave sin. It's not. It's actually pretty normal to spend some of our day, or even a lot of our day, talking about or thinking about things that don't matter that much. But here, it's even more frustrating because the criticism about Chris Pratt isn't trivial. As I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, who a public figure supports matters. Whether they publicly speak out in support of marginalized groups matters. This isn't a distraction, it's a public conversation about something that LGBTQ+ people experience in their real lives. People who claim to support us, but continue to associate with homophobic institutions, or fail to publicly state their affirmation of LGBTQ+ rights. Overall, Mark Ruffalo's statement is a disappointing attempt to redirect the conversation away from Chris Pratt's silence on LGBTQ+ issues and association to homophobic organizations, and make the conversation be about Chris Pratt is nice and we should be worried about the election. I find it quite transparent, but not everyone did. Now let's move on to Robert Downey Jr. This one's a trip. He said, "What a world. The sinless are casting stones at my #brother, Chris Pratt, a real #Christian who lives by #principle and has never demonstrated anything but #positivity and #gratitude. And he just married into a family that makes space for civil discourse, just plain facts, and insists on service as the highest value. If you take issue with Chris, I've got an evil idea. Delete your social media accounts, sit with your own defects of #character, work on them, then celebrate your humanness." And then he tagged Chris Pratt and said something stupid like #I got your back. In my opinion, his statement was somehow even worse than Mark Ruffalo's. He opens with, "What a world." thus setting an exasperated tone for his statement, and then follows with, "The sinless are casting stones." I find this particularly problematic because the majority of Chris Pratt's critics were LGBTQ plus people who are actively hurt by the homophobic belief that a gay lifestyle is sinful, and this belief is held by organizations that Chris Pratt associates with. It's perfectly reasonable to call this out and to want Chris to affirm his support for the LGBTQ plus community. It's not casting stones, it's asking for support. Additionally, referring to his mostly queer critics as sinless, in quotes, implies that they are in fact quite sinful, which is pretty homophobic to say in the context of gay people just wanting acknowledgement that it's not a sin to be gay. He continues his statement with a vague assertion that he's a real Christian who demonstrates positivity and gratitude, as if a lack of positivity and gratitude or him being a real Christian is what this is all about. Then he brings up Chris's marriage, which is irrelevant. He ironically says that his in-laws make space for civil discourse, but Robert Downey Jr. doesn't seem to actually support that. The reason I say this is that despite the fact that many, if not all, of the criticisms of Chris were perfectly civil, Robert Downey Jr. says that anybody with an issue with Chris should just delete their social media and work on their defects. Telling random strangers on the internet to delete their accounts and look at their defects is not especially civil in the context of people wanting someone to denounce homophobia. Aside from the hypocritical nature of his statement about civil discourse, there's another issue at hand. Whether or not LGBTQ plus people should have equality, freedom from discrimination, and the right to marry who they please is not something we can really have civil discourse about. It's inherently uncivil to deny us marriage equality and protection from discrimination. Anybody who's arguing otherwise is not being civil. The criticism about Pratt has always been that he has not voiced support for LGBTQ plus rights, and he continues to attend a church with questionable at best treatment of LGBTQ plus people, which again is a topic for another video. There is no discourse to be had about whether public figures should support LGBTQ rights and people, because they just should support them. Moving on to James Gunn, he said, "Sorry, just finding out about this nonsense. Chris Pratt is the best dude in the world. I've spent hours and hours sharing my deepest truths with this man, as he has with me. Please stop assuming what he believes politically or in any other way just because he's a Christian." James Gunn's statement starts with trying to discredit Pratt's critics by calling their criticism nonsense. He follows it by evading the actual criticism, a problem that I'm sure you're noticing by now, by saying that Pratt is the best dude in the world, and essentially that he knows Pratt very well. He closes out with an interesting plea that people should not assume what Pratt believes because he's Christian. It's interesting because he's misrepresenting the criticism. People don't think Pratt might be anti-gay because he's a Christian. They think he might be anti-gay because his pastor once produced a film that called gay people sexually broken, and also preached at an openly homophobic church before founding his own church. People think he might be anti-gay because despite people asking for clarification for years, Chris Pratt has noticeably been silent on LGBTQ plus issues. His decision to say nothing tells us quite a lot. It's not hard to say, I support LGBTQ rights and marriage equality. If he doesn't like the criticism, he can say that. The fact that he hasn't is enough for people to wonder whether it's because he doesn't support LGBTQ plus rights. In fact, you could argue that failure to voice support for LGBTQ rights, especially after being asked to, is in and of itself an act of not supporting LGBTQ plus rights. Lastly, let's look at Chris's statement in regards to this type of criticism from a few years ago where he was defending his church. He said, "It has recently been suggested that I belong to a church which hates a certain group of people and is infamously anti-LGBTQ. Nothing could be further from the truth. I go to a church that opens its doors to absolutely everyone." He then talks about how they supported him through his divorce, and he says, "Despite what the Bible says, it is what I have seen them do for others on countless occasions, regardless of sexual orientation, race, or gender." Then he says, "I'm not a spokesman for any church or any group of people, and everyone is entitled to love who they want, free from the judgment of their fellow man." Notice there, he still won't talk about gay people, he'll just talk about love vaguely. Even in this statement, he says nothing about LGBTQ plus people or their rights, or says that it's not sinful to live an LGBTQ plus life. He says that they accept people at that church, but what does that mean? Letting them attend the church is a far cry from affirming their sexual orientation or gender, and it doesn't mean much to let someone attend a church if you can't demonstrate that their pastor and church members don't hold bigoted beliefs about them or won't expect them to be closeted at church. The fact that he couldn't just say, "My church and I affirm LGBTQ plus rights," gives away the truth, in my opinion. Hopefully, after going through these statements, you can see what I mean about how they're trying to sort of control and shift the conversation about Chris. It's really hard to argue that your friend supports gay people if he won't publicly say that he does, but it's easy to argue that your friend is nice to you. So they're just pretending that that's what the criticism is about. Unfortunately, many media outlets let them get away with this by simply uncritically reporting on what they said about Chris and then moving on to talk about how his wife just had a baby. Someone who doesn't read any deeper might walk away and say, "See, I knew Chris was a nice guy," and be none the wiser to the actual criticism that people had. Something I want to leave you with is these people's decision to voice support for Chris Pratt stood in stark contrast to their relative silence when Marvel stars faced online harassment and abuse. When Don Cheadle, Tessa Thompson, and Zendaya faced racist vitriol online just for existing in the MCU, these men had nothing to say. When Tessa Thompson, Zendaya, and Brie Larson received misogynistic online abuse, still nothing. They inadvertently revealed their priorities and loyalties with these statements about Chris. You see, they don't have the ability to say that they won't get involved in online drama anymore, or that they don't want to alienate fans by speaking up to support certain co-stars anymore. They've shown that for the right co-star, they're perfectly willing to get into the fray. It's just that their co-stars who aren't white or who are women don't seem to be worth lifting their little Twitter fingers to get involved for. Just Chris Pratt. I wonder what's different about him. So that's my video. I hope you can forgive any lighting issues I might have had. One of my lamps kept shutting off mid-video and I had to turn it back on, but I couldn't remember what brightness it was at, so that was a struggle. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's my first time talking about someone who's not a woman or a TV show that I like, so interesting. Branching out. I make new videos every Wednesday, and I hope that you will comment on this video. Please like the video and subscribe to my channel if you have not. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!